accounted for about 5% of the world industrial production in 1929, about 3% in 1950, but 14% in 1985. A great surge came after 1960. For the next quarter century, industrial production in Mediterranean countries rose by about 6 to 7% annually, faster in Greece, Turkey, Spain, and North Africa, slower in France and Italy. This industrialization contributed mightily to the extraordinary economic improvement in Mediterranean Europe after 1950 and translated into welcome enhancements of nutrition, health, and life expectancy. It also, of course, brought greater pollution. That pollution, naturally, concentrated where industry did, in Italy, France, and Spain. Despite the rapid growth of industry in North Africa, by 1990 it still accounted for only 9% of Mediterranean industry. The several countries ranging from Israel to Croatia accounted for another 10%. Italy generated 2/3 of the industrial production of the Mediterranean basin, Spain a 10th, and France only a 20th. 38. The greatest pollution problems therefore arose northwest of the Mediterranean basin, around the mouths of rivers with industrialized basins, such as the Ebro, Rhône, and around the centers of heavy industry, such as Barcelona, Genoa, and the northern Adriatic coast, from the Delta to Trieste. Industries poured the usual pollutants into the air, rivers, and Mediterranean itself, PCBs, heavy metals such as mercury, lead, and arsenic. Table 5.3 gives a rough indication of the geographic origin of Mediterranean pollutants in 1985. The concentration of heavy industry along the coasts of the Golfe du Lion and the northern Adriatic posed the most acute problems and accounted for the lion's share of the imbalances apparent in Table 5.3. Table 5.3 North-South Environmental Comparison in the Mediterranean, 1985. Source: Grenon and Batisse, 1989:245-6. Note: in the scheme of Grenon and Batisse, North consists of Spain, France, Italy, former Yugoslavia, and Greece. South consists of Turkey, Syria, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco. Outside of these large hotspots, pollution problems developed more recently and more locally. In Greece, for example, 2 industrial clusters developed in the 20th century, around Athens and around Thessaloniki. Between them, they contained all major Greek industry, except for some power plants. Neither city, as late as 1990, had sewage treatment plants. The pollution from almost all of Greece's metallurgical industry, from all of its refineries, paper mills, and shipyards, from 3 of its 4 fertilizer plants, and the sewage generated by half its human population were concentrated in the vicinity of Athens or Thessaloniki. The increasing severity of pollution, and perhaps a decline in the Greek public's tolerance for pollution, combined to produce remedial measures after about 1980. These took the form of incentives to relocate industries and some pollution control. 39. Numerous counterparts to these troubled Greek waters existed. The Gulf of Izmir, the Gulf of Iskenderun, the Gulfs of Tunis and Trieste, and many others all developed major pollution problems. Istanbul's Golden Horn, which had suffered from biological pollution for many centuries, added growing concentrations of toxic metals to the mix after 1913. 40. Indeed, wherever urban and industrial centers grew up on bays, gulfs, or inlets exempted from the general counterclockwise currents of the Mediterranean, pollution accumulated. Eutrophication in the Mediterranean derived less from industry than from agriculture and municipal sewage. From time to time algal blooms, often called red tides, occurred naturally in the Mediterranean as elsewhere in enclosed waters. But they happened much more often in the 20th century because of urbanization and its untreated sewage, and because of the burgeoning use of chemical fertilizers. The most affected areas were the Golfe du Lion, which suffered its most serious blooms after 1980, the Saronic Gulf around Athens, which experienced its first recorded red tide in 1978, and the northern Adriatic. Rivers delivered about 3/4 of the excess nutrients. 41. The northern Adriatic is a shallow shelf with poor circulation. The water warms up every summer and is unusually susceptible to eutrophication. It receives the waters of the Po Valley, where from early in the century farmers used chemical fertilizers. It absorbs the wastewater of several sizable cities and industrial centers. Between 1872 and 1988, the northern Adriatic had 15 recorded eutrophication blooms. That of 1969 was the first large one, that of 1988 the biggest. Their frequency increased after 1969, which probably reflected increased nutrient loadings, but might reflect warmer water temperatures, perhaps both. 42. The increased frequency and severity of blooms, in the northern Adriatic and elsewhere, clouded the waters and sharply reduced the depths at which a particular seagrass grew. Beds of this seagrass play a crucial role as a nursery of many Mediterranean aquatic species, which will suffer in the years to come. 43. In the meantime, algal blooms played havoc with fish populations, seabed life in general, and the tourist trade. Despite a century of intensifying marine pollution, the Mediterranean Sea in the 1990s was no cesspool. Long stretches of coastline in southern Turkey and North Africa, and smaller ones elsewhere, retained clean waters. On straight coastlines where currents scoured the shore unimpeded by capes or headlands, or out in the open sea, pollution, while far from negligible, had yet to make much difference. The Mediterranean was cleaner than the Baltic Sea, the Black Sea, or the Sea of Japan. 44. 3 reasons explain this: its size, its lively mixing of deep and surface waters, and its currents helped to dilute the pollution load. The total pollution load, while growing, paled beside that of the Black Sea and some other unfortunate bodies of water. And Mediterranean societies after 1975 made some concerted efforts to reduce the Mediterranean's pollution. Mediterranean environmental politics after 1975. As in much of the world, explicit environmental awareness and politics around the Mediterranean dates mainly from the 1970s. Most countries by 1975 had tiny bands of ecologically concerned citizens, such as the Corsicans, who in 1973 demonstrated against an Italian chemical plants pollution that disfigured their island shores. 45. By 1980 some countries had green parties. The general political and cultural milieu, if one can generalize, did not favor environmental movements. In none of this, however, were Mediterranean countries exceptional. They were exceptional after 1975 for developing the Mediterranean Action Plan. Under the auspices of the UN Environment Programme, all Mediterranean littoral countries, except Albania, convened in Barcelona and agreed to an ongoing process of environmental management for the entire basin. The plan supported scientific research and integrated development planning. It produced several agreements and protocols to limit pollution. Enforcement normally left something to be desired. For instance, about 2,000 kilometers of coastline were sacrificed to development through lax enforcement or special dispensations. 46. But the plan, together with national regulations and EU restrictions, helped limit Mediterranean pollution from 1976. MAP helped in the construction of sewage treatment plants for Marseilles, Cairo, Alexandria, Aleppo, and several other cities large and small. At the end of the 1980s, work began on sewage works for Thessaloniki and Athens. While the sea 20 years later was more polluted than when MAP began, it surely would have been much more so without MAP. 47. Any accords involving Greece and Turkey, Syria and Israel, and other pairs of sworn enemies must rank as high political achievement. In this case, some of the credit must go to scientists who forged something of a pan-Mediterranean community. Scientific wisdom, normally quickly ignored when hard bargaining begins in international environmental politics, carried unusual weight for one reason: hundreds of billions of tourist dollars were at stake. No country could achieve clean beaches alone, given the circulation of the Mediterranean. Syria needed Israeli cooperation and Israel needed Egypt's. The quest for tourists, who contributed mightily to pollution, paradoxically helped stabilize, and in cases improve, the quality of coastal waters. The oceans. The high seas attract no tourists and have few defenders. Their capacity to dilute makes it very tempting to pollute them. After 1945, the high seas had to accommodate growing doses of metals, chemicals, oil, and nuclear radiation. Consider only plastics. They scarcely existed in 1950, but by 1992 accounted for 60% of beach litter worldwide. Thor Heyerdahl, the Norwegian adventurer and scientist, made 2 raft voyages across the Atlantic. In 1951-1952 he found no sign of human pollution. 18 years later in 1969 he saw oil slicks on 40 of his 57 days at sea, and plastics bobbing in the waves and swells all the way between Cape Verde and Barbados. Had he made a 3rd raft voyage after another 18-year interval, he likely would have found less oil but a lot more plastic. A huge increase in oceanic plastic debris took place after 1970 because the world, especially Europeans and North Americans, used far more plastic without making sufficient provision for its disposal. 48. Efforts to limit pollution of the oceans suffered from 2 problems: the perception that their size negated any ill effects, and the ocean's international character. Individual nations restricted ocean dumping from the 19th century, and did so more energetically after 1970. The United States reduced its industrial waste dumping at sea from 6 million to 1 million tons between 1973 and 1983. Estuaries and bays, such as the Chesapeake, were partly restored. International waters required a more involved politics. The first international accord on oil dumping at sea came in 1954. More concerted effort dates from about 1972, but with scant results. 49 Sufficient incentives for international agreements mandating restraint did not yet exist. The oceans were big enough, like space, that even the 20th century's garbage and pollution mattered only around the edges. Conclusion. The biochemical changes to the Earth's water, chiefly pollution and its abatement, followed the course of industrialization and urbanization, and affected almost every society. Where these trends waxed strongest, pollution became severe, especially after 1945 with the introduction and mass production of new organic chemicals. Pollution damaged lakes and rivers most severely, inland and coastal seas considerably, and the open oceans hardly at all. Before 1800, water pollution was a local matter, important only in the immediate vicinity of cities or certain industries like tanning or glassmaking. In the 19th century, in England and eventually in other industrial centers, it occasionally became a more regional affair. In the 20th century, water pollution often did, changing chemistry and ecosystems in areas as large as Lake Erie or the Baltic Sea. Contaminated water killed tens of millions of people in the 20th century, easily humanity's most costly pollution problem. The provision of safe water for modern cities, begun in the 19th century and carried forward in the 20th, was decisive in shaping modern life. Without it, big cities would be far fewer and far less healthy. But despite this success and our general hydrological ingenuity, a sufficient supply of clean water appears likely to be one of the sharper constraints on the human career in the next century. The scale of pollution increasingly surpassed the thresholds at which waters could assimilate wastes. The favorite method of water pollution control for millennia, dilution, worked less and less often in the 20th century. Newer methods worked only where they were tried, and even there not perfectly. Cleaning up the water of the Rhine to the point that fish returned was comparatively easy. The river gets new water all the time, and only a few nations, which after 1948 were fairly friendly to one another and fairly rich, were involved. Cleaning up the Mediterranean, quite incompletely achieved, proved harder. Decades rather than weeks were required for the system to flush itself out. More countries, some of them mutual enemies, many of them poor, had to cooperate. The oceans are difficult to pollute seriously because of their size, but should it be done, they will be nearly impossible to clean up. Chapter 6. The Hydrosphere, Depletions, Dams, and Diversions. And thou beholdest the earth blackened, then, when we send down water upon it, it quivers, and swells, and puts forth herbs of every joyous kind. Quran 22:5. When the well's dry, we know the worth of water. Ben Franklin, Poor Richard's Almanac. In 1908, Winston Churchill, on a tour of Africa, stood near the northern shores of Lake Victoria. He watched the waters of the world's second largest lake flow over Owen Falls into the world's longest river, the Nile. He later recorded his thoughts, provoked by the grandeur of the place, so much power running to waste, such a lever to control the natural forces of Africa unripped, cannot but vex and stimulate the imagination. And what fun to make the immemorial Nile begin its journey by diving into a turbine. Imaginations remained vexed for some time. World Wars and the Great Depression intervened, but in 1946, after suitable studies and plans, construction began on the Owen Falls Dam. In 1954, when Churchill was Prime Minister for the second time, the Nile waters at last dove into turbines. Lake Victoria became a reservoir, and Uganda and Western Kenya got 150,000 kilowatts of electrical capacity. Churchill's outlook reflected the dominant approach to water in the 20th century. He saw it as a resource, and it irked him to see that resource unexploited. Its development, he thought, promised a better future, in this case for Uganda and the British Empire. And, of course, recasting nature could be fun, particularly for those with Churchill's boyish bent and the confidence in the justice of one's cause that British imperialists in the age of Rudyard Kipling often possessed. A great deal has changed in the hydrosphere because of men who felt much the same way Churchill did. Lenin, Franklin Roosevelt, Nehru, Deng Xiaoping, and a host of lesser figures saw water in much the same way, and encouraged massive water projects in the USSR, the United States, India, and China. They did so because they all lived in an age in which states and societies regarded adjustments to nature's hydrology as a route to greater power or prosperity. And they had unprecedented technological means at their disposal. Since 1850, hydraulic engineers and their political masters have reconfigured the planet's plumbing. They did so to accommodate the needs of the evolving economy, but also for reasons of public health, geopolitics, pork barrel politics, symbolic politics, and no doubt to satisfy their vanity and playfulness. To get water in the right amounts in the right places at the right times for whatever one wishes to do with it requires hydraulic engineering, one of humankind's oldest sciences. In the 20th century, with methods ancient and modern, we built several million dams, tube wells, canals, aqueducts, and pipelines to divert water from the destinations gravity had in store for it. This chapter explains what physical changes humans wrought in the hydrosphere after 1900, how we came to divert much of the world's fresh water from its previous paths and rhythms in order to serve our manifold purposes. Groundwater. One of the most important, and to many minds most troubling, changes in the hydrosphere fostered in the 20th century was the intensive use of groundwater. People dug wells for millennia in order to irrigate fields and provide for drinking water. Considerable effort and ingenuity went into it. Ancient Chinese well diggers went as deep as 500 meters, but in the end, limits of muscle and wind power imposed constraints on the pace of groundwater exploitation. Cheap energy, a distinguishing feature of the 20th century, helped make it feasible to pump groundwater on a massive scale. Although groundwater is abundant almost everywhere, it is only where surface water is scarce and energy cheap that huge quantities of water are brought to the surface. The Middle East and the American West are the best examples. In the high plains of the United States, most years lack the rainfall to raise the crops American farmers and markets prefer. From the late 19th century, wind-powered pumps helped farmers make a go of it from Texas to Montana. But the best high plains windmills could draw water from no deeper than 10 meters and could irrigate no more than about 3 hectares of wheat. With well-digging techniques improved by the oil industry and with cheap gasoline and natural gas, by the mid-1930s farmers could tap underground water without a huge investment. They began to pump up the Ogallala Aquifer, a body of water equal in volume to Lake Huron, but stretching from the Texas Panhandle to western South Dakota. The Ogallala is actually a very slow underground river, dripping inches per day southeast through a gravelly bed at a depth of less than 100 meters. The water now there has seeped through the Ogallala's gravel for 10,000 to 25,000 years. The searing drought of the 1930s sharpened the thirst of the high plains, and post-war opportunity deepened it further. The newly accessible Ogallala seemed an answer to the prayers of Dust Bowl farmers, a reliable source of water, equivalent to rain on demand. Use intensified after 1945 and quadrupled between 1950 and 1980, spurred on by droughts in the 1950s and 1970s. By the late 1970s, Ogallala water accounted for 1/5 of the irrigated area in the United States. A goodly chunk of the country's wheat, corn, alfalfa, and even cotton depended on it. Nearly 40% of the nation's cattle drank Ogallala water and ate grain produced with it. Farmers drained it at a rate of a little under 1% per year in the late 1970s, drawing water 10 times faster than the aquifer could recharge under the best conditions. Many good livings came from this. Clarence Jiggett, a rancher and farmer who probably used more Ogallala water than anyone else, made himself a multi-millionaire on the dry sand hills of southwestern Kansas. He applied center pivot irrigation to raise grain and cattle on land no one else wanted and made it pay. 6. Key locations in water manipulation history. The end of this water boom is in sight. In the southern reaches of the High Plains, where exploitation began first, farmers soon had to go deeper and deeper to get it, and many found the costs did not justify the results. In northern Texas, irrigation declined after 1974, and in the High Plains generally, irrigation contracted after 1983. While farmers' decisions to irrigate or not depend on many things, such as energy costs and crop prices, the drawdown of the Ogallala played a large role. Since the late 1970s, states have come to agreements about who gets how much Ogallala water, and extraction rates have stabilized. But they have not declined. Across the High Plains, 150,000 pumps work day and night during the growing seasons. Farmers around Sublette, Kansas, figured in 1970 they had about 300 years' worth of water left. In 1980, they reckoned they had 70 years' supply, in 1990 less than 30. Half the accessible water was gone by 1993, and hydrologists and farmers agree the bonanza will end in 20 or 30 years, more if conservation triumphs, less if there is another drought. While it took many millennia to fill, the Ogallala's usefulness to humankind. The Arabian Peninsula and Libya also combine considerable groundwater supplies with cheap energy. When oil markets in the 1970s sent billions of dollars their way, the Saudis invested some of that in schemes to exploit their aquifers. They now get 70 to 90% of their fresh water from underground. Although it takes 1,000 tons of water to raise a single ton of wheat, Saudi policy after 1975 was to grow wheat in the desert at 5 times the international market price in order to be self-sufficient in food. After 1984, Saudi Arabia exported wheat regularly. The Arabian aquifers scarcely recharge at all, so they too will not last. The Saudis hope that desalination of seawater will become a practical alternative and will relax the historical constraint of water supply in Arabia. It is a bold gamble. The Libyan scheme is water manipulation on the heroic scale. Libya is a big country with a small population. Southern Libya, in the heart of the Sahara Desert, lies on top of vast amounts of fossil water. In the 1920s, when Libya was an Italian colony, Benito Mussolini hoped to match Britain's success with oil in Iraq by drilling in Libya. Disappointed Italian petroleum engineers found only aquifers. After Libyan independence in 1951, American oilmen found more aquifers. But the water lay far from any center of population, 40 days by camel over shifting dunes. So the water stayed put. That changed after the 1969 revolution when Colonel Muammar al-Gaddafi decided to make Libya self-sufficient in food and fiber. He convinced the American billionaire Armand Hammer, the head of Occidental Petroleum, to help build pipelines to deliver the Saharan water to the Libyan coasts. A good share of Libya's oil revenues went into the Great Man-Made River, a system of 2 major pipelines buried under the sands, capable of delivering water equal to about 5% of the Nile's flow. The coastal regions around Tripoli and Benghazi can now raise crops on a scale quite impossible before the river began to flow in 1986. The water cost 4 to 10 times as much as the value of the crops it produced, and in conventional accounting was a massive money loser for Libya. After the collapse of oil prices in the early 1980s, Libya had trouble footing the bills. But Korean and American construction firms did well by the project, and Gaddafi found it useful in his efforts to secure the support of an occasionally restive population. This is the accounting that mattered, and explains Libya's persistence with the project, despite its economics and the troubles it caused with Egypt and Chad, which objected that the great man-made river might poach their water. Less grandiose schemes to make use of groundwater emerged in Mexico, Europe, India, China, and elsewhere. While the water lasts, groundwater irrigation improves agricultural production, and its relative purity makes it attractive for urban water systems. But inevitably, sooner or later, the water runs short, and difficult adjustments must follow. In Uttar Pradesh, India's largest state, the government provided wells for 2,700 villages between 1970 and 1985. This made life notably easier until the water table dropped and 2,300 of the wells went dry. Despite massive investment in water infrastructure, in 1985 drinking water in most of India was harder to come by than in 1970. In Europe, where most big cities by 1990 were drawing down groundwater supplies, aquifer mining ran up against limits, especially in Greece and Spain. Many cities around the world relied on groundwater to slake their thirsts, with various results. Rapid urban growth in Beijing and Mexico City, among many other places, depleted local aquifers and obliged authorities to look further afield for imported water. Both cities were subsiding in the late 20th century as their groundwater disappeared, as was Bangkok, Houston, and many others. Tokyo too was sinking, by about 5 meters between 1920 and 1965, due to groundwater depletion, but after 1961 government controls on withdrawals stabilized the situation. Barcelona, while not subsiding, depleted its freshwater aquifers under the Llobregat River Delta after 1965, allowing seawater to seep in. Some of the old industrial cities of Europe, such as Birmingham, Liverpool, and Paris, reduced their groundwater withdrawals after 1970 as industry declined. Fewer withdrawals led to problems as well. Tunnels, basements, and other subterranean structures were built when industrial water use kept the water table low, and now with higher groundwater they flooded more often. New technologies and cheap energy in the 20th century allowed aquifer mining on a grand scale. This made deserts bloom and cities grow, lubricating a few economic booms. But it was a short-term remedy for water shortage, and often clearly unsustainable, as the experience of northern Texas shows. In some cases, the practice could, with luck, serve as a bridge to an age of cheap desalination of seawater. The aquifer age will prove a passing phase, except in happy situations where pumping rates do not outstrip recharge. Dams and diversions. Dams and diversions, another ancient technology, provoked even greater changes in the hydrosphere. The earliest dam of which any trace or record remains diverted Nile water near Memphis, in ancient Egypt, 4,900 years ago. The early Han Dynasty. In China built earthen dams as high as 30 meters. Sri Lanka and Mesopotamia were other early cradles of dam technology. Earth and rock dams had their limits, which checked the potential of dam building for millennia. But after 1850, applied science, civil engineering, hydraulics, and fluid mechanics opened the way for larger and larger dams, first in Europe and then, at the turn of the century, in the United States. Some states, like Italy and colonial India, built networks of modest-sized dams. Others, like Egypt, built on the heroic scale. A few, like the United States, the USSR, and post-colonial India, did both. Engineering and political considerations affected the choices. All dam builders sought changes in landscape, hydrology, economy, and society, and got them, although not always the ones they wanted. Most dam construction in the 19th century, as previously, aimed to extend irrigation. Lesser goals included flood control and impoundment for reservoirs. By the turn of the century, dams were also built to create electricity. Dams generally had only one main purpose until the 1930s, when the United States pioneered the development of river basin management and multipurpose dams. The Tennessee Valley Authority, the first such project, inspired imitation along the Volga in the USSR, in India, and elsewhere. The Boulder Dam on the Colorado River, the world's largest when it was built in the 1930s, inspired admiration almost everywhere. The giant dams served larger political purposes wherever they were built. Communists, Democrats, colonialists, and anti-colonialists all saw some appeal in big dams. Governments liked the image they suggested, an energetic, determined state capable of taming rivers for the social good. Dams helped to legitimate governments and popularize leaders, something the United States needed more than ever in the Depression years, and something Stalin, Nehru, Nasser, Nkrumah, and others all sought. Dam projects received great publicity, especially from about 1930 to 1970. Ambitious, modernizing states, especially colonial and newly independent ones with legitimacy problems, showed great fondness for dam building. So did Cold War hegemons, keen to display the virtues of their social and political systems. Their political utility helps explain why so many uneconomic and ecologically dubious dams exist. 11. During the 1960s, more than one large dam was completed per day on average. The historic climax came in 1968. Although the pace tailed off, dam construction continued, so that by the 1990s about two-thirds of the globe's streamflow passed over or through dams of one sort or another. 12. The Indus and India. The first great 20th century water project involved one of the world's great rivers, the Indus, the greatest colonial power of the day, Britain, its most important colony, India. The Indus and its major tributary, the Sutlej, rise in the western Himalaya and flow through some arid lands, in what is now eastern Pakistan and northwestern India, to the Arabian Sea. This region is known as the Punjab, or Land of the Five Rivers. The Indus is about 3,000 kilometers long, with a flow twice that of the Nile. People have used its waters for irrigation for 4,500 years. Today, the Indus Basin in Pakistan and India is home to the world's largest irrigation scheme. 13. The modern scheme began in 1885, when the government of British India undertook to rebuild and extend some of the Mughal waterworks in the western Punjab. 14. They did so, and much more. Engineering skill and endless toil turned the steppe and desert of the Punjab into wheat fields, creating farming settlements based on a network of irrigation canals, canal colonies. By 1947, the scheme extended over an area of about 14 million hectares and permitted the largest agricultural expansion in the history of British India. Punjabis from far and wide migrated to these new colonies, replacing the scattered cattle and camel herders who had previously roamed the land and, to British dismay, had paid almost no tax. Thus a social transformation matched the ecological one. The British regarded it as a signal success because it created one of the more prosperous peasantries in Asia, raising 2 crops a year on the Punjab's sandy loam. By 1915, the transformed Punjab provided more tax revenue for the Crown than any other district in India, and created loyal subjects too. Punjabis volunteered in droves for service in World War I because veterans could expect irrigated land in return. The British India Army enjoyed strong support in the Punjab. The British scheme shaped life and land in the Punjab long after the eclipse of the Raj. Indus irrigation helped prevent the success of the Indian National Congress, or an equivalent, in what became Pakistan, as residents of the canal colonies remained loyal to Britain until the eve of independence in 1947. This political effect did independent Pakistan no good. Army leaders and landholders inherited a powerful position upon independence, thanks in large part to the canal colonies, and they dominated the country ever after, successfully resisting land reform and personalizing politics. Pakistan expanded the irrigation network after 1947 and promoted export crops such as oilseed and long staple cotton. In 1990, Pakistan had about 16 million hectares under irrigation and more irrigated area per person than almost any country in the world. 15 The old elites overcame all challenges to their power, despite their continual internecine quarrels. The Indus irrigation system also brought international and environmental repercussions. With profitable irrigation in the Punjab, both in Pakistan and India, water became valuable enough to add to the friction between the two countries. A treaty in 1960 helped damp down high feelings. But it could do nothing to prevent salinization, a common curse of irrigation schemes. Salt had sapped the yields of Punjabi wheat from at least the 1860s, even before massive irrigation aggravated matters. By the 1960s, the problem had grown acute, as repeated floodings left soils waterlogged and raised the groundwater level, carrying dissolved salts up with it, into the roots of crops, checking plant growth. Fortunately for Punjabi farmers, Pakistan mattered to the United States as a Cold War ally, which helped convince the Kennedy administration to dispatch a technical mission to address these problems. It recommended pumping to lower the water table and protect crop roots from salt. Foreign aid money duly built thousands of tube wells. 16 But rising groundwater and salinization continued to haunt 80% of the Punjab Canal colonies into the 1990s, when foreign financing for drainage schemes dried up, leaving Punjabi farmers high and dry in their fields, increasingly saline. 17 Independent India also took part in the rising tide of irrigation in the 20th century. In the Ganges Basin, the British had begun major irrigation works in the 1820s, again rebuilding Mughal systems. By 1947, irrigation nourished 22 million hectares of India, 32 million hectares in 1974, and by the 1990s, 45 million to 50 million hectares, equivalent to California or Spain. India accounted for about one-fifth of the global total, neck and neck with China as the world's leader in irrigated cropland. India also developed its hydroelectric potential, especially after 1975. India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, called dams temples of modern India. According to one reckoning, dam building accounted for 15% of planned state expenditure between 1947 and 1982. 18 Dams for irrigation and hydroelectric power were the most prominent ingredient of the development effort following independence. 19 This dam-building program buoyed India's food production and its industry in the second half of the century. 20 But the social and environmental costs of modern India's temples ran high. Dams and reservoirs displaced perhaps 20 million people between 1947 and 1992. In one instance, the Rihan project in Uttar Pradesh in the 1960s, ousted peasants received no advance warning and had to flee for their lives while rising waters drowned their homes. 21 India's tribal populations, often located in hilly areas suitable for hydroelectric development, lacked the political power to resist dam building and often found themselves refugees. None of India's irrigation or hydroelectric projects after 1947 came in within budget or on time, and few lived up to their billing in terms of electric power, irrigation, or durability. Reservoirs silted up on average 2 to 4 times faster than planners promised. Waterlogged lands and salinization also plagued India, forcing the withdrawal between 1955 and 1985 of 13 million hectares from cultivation, more than a quarter of India's irrigated area. 22 Many dam reservoirs promoted malaria. Some obliterated forests in the Himalayan foothills or the Western Ghats. 23 With problems like these, Indian dam projects aroused political opposition. The first notable peasant resistance came in the early 1920s. More followed, some of which succeeded in preventing planned dams, most did not. But in the 1980s and 1990s, popular resistance to dam building stalled some major projects. In 1989, 60,000 people rallied against the Nirmala irrigation scheme, a gigantic project of 30 major dams and over 3,000 smaller ones. The Nirmala River flows into the sea near Surat, some 350 kilometers north of Bombay. Its banks host an unusual number of holy sites, many of which stood to be flooded out. Despite the World Bank's withdrawal from the Nirmala scheme, India's commitment to irrigation and to prestige projects remained. The Nirmala scheme would displace at least another 100,000 people. 24 The Soviet Union and the Aral Sea. The irrigation scheme for the Indus may be the world's largest and those for India the most contested, but Central Asia's scheme is the most dramatic in its consequences. In its quest for cotton, the USSR created the single greatest irrigation disaster of the 20th century. Like India's dam-building difficulties, the case of the Aral Sea represents cavalier water manipulation by arrogant political and scientific elites, justified in the name of the people. The Aral Sea's demise is the climactic chapter in a long and checkered history of Soviet water. Imperial Russia was despotic but not hydraulic. Central Asia's ancient irrigation systems declined or were purposely destroyed in the 19th century when Russia conquered the region. 25. The Bolsheviks, in 1917, inherited a country with little irrigation and little water management other than the provision of piped water to some major cities. One of Lenin's early decrees encouraged irrigation in Turkmenistan, but Soviet policy scarcely affected the hydrosphere until the 1930s. Stalin and his successors believed that Soviet engineering could customize the hydrosphere to meet the economic and political needs of a rapidly industrializing country struggling to build communism before its enemies destroyed it. In this climate, half measures had no place, projects had to be big, targets heroic, and deadlines ambitious. Naturally, corners had to be cut. From Stalin's point of view, the availability of millions of cost-free laborers after the early 1930s, the political prisoners of the Soviet gulags, made giant projects all the more tempting. A new era dawned with hydroelectric installations, the first major one of which spanned the Volga in 1937. More dams and irrigation schemes sprouted along the Volga, which became a series of large ponds, and on the Dnieper, the Don, and the Dniester. By the 1950s, diversions reduced the streamflow of all the large rivers in the southwestern USSR. As the Don and Ural rivers shrank, engineers channeled Volga water through canals to top them up. That shortchanged the Caspian Sea, already shrinking because of consumptive use of Volga waters. 26 Irrigation using the Don and Kuban rivers deprived the Sea of Azov of its freshwater flow, making it far saltier and ruining its once magnificent sturgeon, bream, and perch fisheries. 27 By 1975, the USSR used 8 times as much water as in 1913, most of it for irrigation. 28 The maximization of the USSR's economic potential required water, so these rivers were bent to the will of the state and its planners. Technological capacity, ideological zeal, political ambition and much else combined in the 1950s to convince Soviet officials and engineers to tackle the great rivers of Central Asia, the Sir Darya and the Amu Darya. These rivers carried snowmelt from high mountains into the closed basin of the Aral Sea, then the world's 4th largest lake. For millennia they had provided water for Central Asian societies. In the early 20th century, these rivers gave up slightly more of their water as irrigation slowly expanded. But by the 1950s, Soviet planners had something grander in mind, the creation of a vast irrigated cotton belt that would make the USSR cotton independent. The demise of the Aral Sea was a planned assassination. The president of the Turkmen Academy of Sciences, Babayev, voiced the conventional view in the late 1950s. I belong to those scientists who consider that drying up of the Aral is far more advantageous than preserving it. First, in its zone, good fertile land will be obtained. Cultivation of alone will pay for the existing Aral Sea, with all its fisheries, shipping, and other industries. Second, the disappearance of the sea will not affect the region's landscapes. 29. Such views pervaded the corridors of power. Skeptics were ignored, or worse. Irrigation in Soviet Central Asia spread to about 7 million hectares by 1990, an area the size of Ireland, and the USSR not only became cotton independent, it became the world's 2nd largest exporter of white gold. It was among the world's lowest quality cotton, marketable mainly to customers with few options in the Soviet sphere in Eastern Europe. The investment in cotton strangled the Aral Sea. Prior to 1960, its influx had averaged about 55 cubic kilometers a year, a flow comparable to the Niger or Snake rivers. It dropped sharply in 1960, 1961, and continued to shrink with each passing year. By 1980, the Aral got only a fifth of its former water influx, and by the 1990s at most a tenth and occasionally nothing at all. The Aral sea level began to fall, slowly in the 1960s, but faster after about 1973. By the mid-1990s, the Aral Sea stood more than 15 meters below its pre-1960 level and covered less than half its former seabed. In 1990, it became 2 seas, as a land bridge emerged in the north. Their total volume stood at about a third that of 1960. The salinity of Aral water tripled between 1960 and 1993.30. The Russians once called the Aral the Blue Sea. Aral Deniz in the Turkic tongues of Central Asia means Sea of Islands. More and more islands have appeared, but soon it seems the Aral will be neither blue nor insular. It will be a salt pen the size of Ireland, dotted by a few brackish ponds. This will surely be the greatest hydrological change yet engineered by humankind. In the meantime, some of the broader consequences for Central Asia became apparent in the 1980s. Dr. Babayev notwithstanding, the entire Aral Sea region was affected. The ability of the Aral Sea to moderate local climate shrank with the sea. Summer heat and winter cold grew more extreme, and the cotton belt's growing season shrank by about 2 weeks. With less evaporation from the Aral Sea, air became drier and the snowpacks that feed the Sir Darya and Amu Darya began to contract. The winds sweeping over the seabed picked up less moisture and more salt, lifted from the saline crusts left behind by the retreating waters. The Aral Sea had once received salt from the watersheds of its rivers. By the late 1980s the tables had turned, and the seabed exported airborne salt to the cotton belt. Aerial salinization lowered crop yields, ruined pastures, corroded power lines and concrete structures, and caused eye ailments. In Kazakhstan, pastures some 200 kilometers distant from the Aral Sea began to acquire a blanket of salt. 31. The fisheries of the Aral Sea yielded about 40,000 tons annually in the 1950s. They disappeared by 1990. The Minack cannery was maintained until the early 1990s by airlifting frozen fish from the Baltic and sending it across the Trans-Siberian Railroad from the Pacific, surely one of the great diseconomies of modern times. 20 of 24 endemic fish species went extinct. Tens of thousands of jobs did too. Minack's human population declined from 40,000 to 12,000 by 1995. The water table beneath the river's deltas dropped by 5 to 10 meters between 1970 and 1990, and the groundwater grew saltier as well. This did in alluvial forests, wetlands, and pasture, which gave way to salt-resistant vegetation. The local Kzyk cellulose and carton combine had to import its raw material from Siberia. By 1990, nearly half the mammal species present in 1960 had vanished, as had 3/4 of the bird species. Aside from the impacts of the desiccation of the Aral Sea, the cotton belt suffered from the usual ailments of giant irrigation schemes and monocultures. About half the diverted water evaporated or seeped into the earth, serving no human purpose whatsoever. In Turkmenistan, seepage from the Karakum Canal threatened to swamp its capital city, Ashgabat. After 1970, engineers drilled scores of wells to pump the rising groundwater out of the city. Salinization damaged fields, affecting half the cotton area in Uzbekistan and 4/5 in Turkmenistan. Cotton pests thrived, causing farmers to drench their crop with pesticides, which contaminated drinking water. The human health effects of irrigation in Soviet Central Asia became severe by the 1980s. Kazakhstan officials discouraged breastfeeding of infants because of dangerous pesticide residues in mother's milk. The redoubtable ambition of this Central Asian plumbing operation pales beside plans that the USSR shelved in 1986. In previous decades, visionary scientists and bureaucrats had hoped to divert water from northern Russian lakes into the Volga to address the difficulties arising from the sinking Caspian Sea level. Grander still, they hoped to reverse the northward flow of the great Siberian rivers, such as the Ob and Yenisei, so as to provide more irrigation water for Central Asia. Works began on the former project in 1984, but Mikhail Gorbachev quailed at the costs and spiked both plans in 1986. The breakup of the USSR in 1991 made such schemes all the more improbable, as Russia no longer has much stake in the cotton export earnings of Uzbekistan, to the regret of many Central Asians who still saw Siberian water as their salvation. 32. Egypt, Aswan, and the Nile. Egypt, as Herodotus noted, is an acquired country, the gift of the Nile. For the last 10,000 years, that gift, water and silt, mainly from Ethiopia, made a long ribbon of the Egyptian desert habitable and gradually built the Nile Delta over the continental shelf. In the 20th century, Egyptians spurned half the Ethiopian gift in trying to improve upon the other half. The prominence of Egypt in history derives from its unique geography. The Nile was a two-way highway because northeast winds in most seasons allowed upstream sailing while the river's flow wafted traffic downstream. More important still was the annual flood, prompted by monsoon rains in the Ethiopian highlands. The late summer flood brought moisture and on average about a millimeter of fertile silt to the river's banks, floodplain, and delta every year, permitting cultivation of winter crops such as barley and wheat. Improvements upon the gift began some 5,000 years ago, with irrigation canals, later supplemented by mechanical devices. The flood immunized Egypt against the scourge of irrigation regimes, salinization. The gift came with strings attached, however. If Ethiopia's monsoon rains were light, then the Nile did not rise, producing a low Nile, crops failed, and famine resulted. If the rains were especially heavy, the Nile rose too much and swept away the settlements along its banks. The rulers of modern Egypt changed the country's agriculture and economy in ways that made these ancient strings intolerable. So they changed the Nile too. The first modern irrigation efforts began with Muhammad Ali, an Albanian adventurer in Ottoman service. As Pasha of Egypt after 1805, he aimed to free himself from Ottoman control, to strengthen the country lest Britain or France take it, and to enrich himself and his followers. To these ends, he proposed irrigation barrages, or low earthen dams, in the lower Nile, using stones from the Giza pyramids. He was dissuaded from this scheme, but beginning in 1842 he built barrages made of less precious stone. Finished in 1861, after Muhammad Ali's death, they adjusted the lower Nile's flow in an effort to suit the demands of cotton cultivation. Cotton was a summer crop, harvested in August or September. Formerly, when barley and wheat were the mainstays of Egyptian agriculture, a heavy late summer flood, while dangerous to life and property, could not ruin the springtime harvest. Only a low Nile, restricting cultivation, could bring famine to Egypt. But in the 19th century, with cotton cultivation and the growing importance of maize as a summer food crop, this changed. A surging flood could ruin the cotton and maize crops before the late summer harvest, at a stroke destroying a good part of the country's food supply and almost all of its exports, bad for the hungry peasants, for the cotton kings whose incomes vanished, and for the state, whose revenues dried up. With the new crops and new economy, big floods became far more costly than before. Moreover, ordinary floods, which covered low-lying parts of the delta for months each year, now became a real constraint on the country's potential cotton production. Cotton was the moneymaker which, Muhammad Ali had hoped, would allow Egypt to import the wherewithal for rapid modernization. The cotton grew, Egypt's production multiplied sixfold from 1855 to 1882, but the scheme failed. Egypt defaulted on debts in 1876, providing the excuse, if not the genuine motive, for foreign intervention. Britain occupied Egypt, beginning in 1882. When Lord Cromer, Consul General of Egypt from 1883 to 1907, convinced London authorities that this occupation was not to be temporary after all, Britain began where Muhammad Ali's descendants left off. Britain would tame the Nile to protect Egypt. The British acquisition of the Sudan in 1898 followed in part from anxiety over Egypt's water supply. With help from Cromer's family bank, Baring Brothers, a low Aswan dam was erected in 1902. It was heightened in 1912 and 1934. This helped store water for the dry months, but it could not store sufficient water to safeguard against prolonged drought. Nor could it contain a big flood. In practice, after 1934, it captured only the tail end, about a fifth, of the annual flood. 34. A much larger dam could do more. As early as 1876, a British officer had proposed such a dam to the Khedive of Egypt. The idea vanished from official thinking but was resurrected by Adrian Daninos, a Greek-Egyptian engineer who hoped it might permit the electrification of Egypt. Daninos proposed a high dam at Aswan in 1912, but sparked no interest in high circles. He tried again in the late 1940s, but British hydrologists by then had settled on schemes to impound Nile water in Uganda, Sudan, and Ethiopia. But Daninos soon got his way. In 1952, Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser and his fellow free officers, nationalist revolutionaries in the army, seized power in Egypt, determined to rid the country of residual British influence and the shame of poverty and weakness. A month after the coup, Daninos approached two army engineers of his acquaintance, members of the Free Officers Technical Advisory Group, with his idea of a high dam. They offered the idea to Nasser, who was fast becoming the strongman of Egypt. He seized upon it quickly. Nasser saw in a high dam at Aswan a symbol that would contribute to the heroic, vigorous image he sought for himself, his revolutionary regime, and for Arab nationalism. He also saw in it a reliable water supply for Egypt and sufficient hydroelectric power to transform Egypt into an industrial state. Linking himself to the pharaohs, Nasser said, "In antiquity we built pyramids for the dead. Now we build pyramids for the living." The dam would help him bring true independence and everlasting prosperity to Egypt. 35. From the hydrological point of view, a high dam was misplaced at Aswan in southern Egypt, one of the highest evaporation zones on Earth. A reservoir there would increase the surface area from which precious Nile water might evaporate. The proper site for water storage was far upstream, at high elevations, where cooler air would permit far less evaporation. The British hydrologist scheme involved dams in Ethiopia and Uganda that would store water in existing lakes. This plan made impeccable hydrological sense. It made political sense to the British while Britain controlled Uganda and Sudan and remained influential in Ethiopia and Egypt. It was even endorsed as policy in 1949 by the Egyptian cabinet. But after 1952, different Egyptian nationalist sensibilities prevailed. Dams in foreign countries did not suit Nasser. He did not trust Britain or the emerging states of Sudan, Ethiopia, and Uganda with the lifeblood of Egypt. Nasser, it turned out, had good reason. Britain's Prime Minister Anthony Eden would soon be calling for his head. For many reasons, Anglo-Egyptian relations deteriorated after 1952. Nasser concluded a deal with Czechoslovakia for Soviet weaponry early in 1955, and some in London and Washington feared he would soon be Moscow's puppet. In an effort to dissuade Nasser from accepting Soviet support for an Aswan dam, Britain and the United States agreed to finance it in 1955. But this did not make Nasser cooperative, and in the summer of 1956 the United States and Britain announced they would not, after all, lend money for the dam. Within a week, Nasser seized the Suez Canal, until then run by a British company, and proclaimed that its revenues would finance the construction at Aswan. This move led to the Franco-British-Israeli attack on Egypt in October 1956, known as the Suez Crisis. The Americans refused to back this attack, and Britain, France, and Israel could not pay for it alone. Amid the gnashing of ministerial teeth, London and Paris had to curtail the invasion and retreat. Nasser triumphed, becoming a great hero in Egypt, the Arab world, and the colonized world generally. Britain and France suffered keen humiliation and had to accelerate, or create, plans for the decolonization of their empires. Meanwhile, Soviet engineers drew up plans for the high dam in the late 1950s. Construction began in 1960 and ended in 1971, a year after Nasser's death. The Soviet Union, and receipts from Suez Canal traffic, paid the bill. The political consequences of the difficult birth of the Aswan High Dam reached around the world. 36. Aswan's environmental consequences were only regional in scope, stretching from Sudan to the central Mediterranean. The Aswan High Dam can store about 150 cubic kilometers of water in Lake Nasser, equivalent to 2 or 3 years' worth of Nile flow, and 30 times more than the 1934 dam held. It stopped 98% of the silt that formerly had coated the inhabited part of Egypt. 37. It revolutionized Egyptian agriculture, allowing more systematic use of water, permitting 2 or 3 crops per year. It provided full flood control, safeguarding the cotton crop against even the heaviest of floods. Production of rice, maize, and cotton, all summer crops, flourished. The Nile below Aswan became a mammoth irrigation ditch, completely tamed. The high dam's turbines generated about a third of Egypt's electricity between 1977 and 1990.38. In these respects, the Aswan High Dam fulfilled Nasser's expectations, although it did not make Egypt prosperous and independent. The dam improved markedly upon half of the gift of the Nile. But it revoked the other half. The Ethiopian soil subsidy ceased to arrive after 1963. Without a top-dressing of fertile silt, Egyptian agriculture had to turn heavily to chemical fertilizers, of which Egypt became one of the world's top users. Much of Aswan's electric power went to fertilizer factories. Salinization also emerged as a serious threat. Without the annual floods flushing, soils kept more salts. Salt accumulation afflicted the northernmost delta, where seawater intruded as much as 50 kilometers inland, the Nile Valley, where reliable and free water led to overuse, waterlogging, higher water tables, and consequent salt buildup, and wherever groundwater was tapped. The Nile descends only 87 meters from Aswan to the Mediterranean Sea, a distance of some 1,200 kilometers. With such a gentle slope, drainage of irrigated fields was a costly problem never satisfactorily addressed. Soviet engineers did no better with this problem in Egypt than they did in Central Asia. In a country with so slender a resource base as Egypt, and with 1 million more mouths to feed each year in the 1990s, menaces to agriculture were urgent matters. 39. Perhaps more ominously, the Nile Delta began to shrink. The Delta is home to 30 million people and accounts for 2/3 of Egypt's agricultural area. The Delta was born about 7,500 years ago and by the early 20th century covered about 24,000 square kilometers, roughly the area of Albania or Maryland. During the 19th century, the Delta expanded into the Mediterranean by about 5 to 8 kilometers at some points. But with the 1902 dam, its advance stalled and in places reversed. Mediterranean currents swept away the deposition of prior ages slightly faster than new silt could make good the loss. After 1964, the sea routed the delta because silt delivery virtually ceased. The coastline retreated in places as fast as 70 to 90 meters per year, nudging people inland and stranding lighthouses offshore. Sediment instead collected in Lake Nasser, forming a new inland Nile delta, which by 1996 was a tenth the size of the original but less conveniently placed Point 40. The dam did more than withhold useful silt. It deprived the Mediterranean of the nutrients the Nile carried, destroying sardine and shrimp fisheries that had employed 30,000 Egyptians. The fisheries of Egypt's coastal lagoons also withered, with fewer nutrients and more pollutants. Without the flushing of the flood, the irrigation canals of Egypt became ideal habitat for water hyacinth, a beautiful but pernicious weed. The snails that carry schistosomiasis, a debilitating disease that attacks the liver, urinary tract, or intestines, love water hyacinth, need stagnant water, and consequently flourished in the New Egypt. Schistosomiasis infection rates increased 5 to 10-fold among rural Egyptians with the transition to perennial irrigation, and after 1975 approached 100% in many communities. 41 Thus the loss of silt and other effects of the Aswan High Dam imposed serious, and escalating, environmental and health costs on the Egyptian population. The dam also swamped and corroded the cultural heritage of the Nile Valley. Part of that heritage now lies beneath Lake Nasser. Elsewhere along the Nile, constant irrigation and poor drainage raised water tables, bringing moisture to the bases of countless monuments. This moisture crept into ancient stone and eventually evaporated, leaving salts behind. These salts recrystallized, cracking stone surfaces and destroying the art etched or painted on them millennia ago. Just as 25 years of air pollution did more damage than 2,500 years of weathering to the treasures of the Athenian Acropolis, so with 25 years of salt creep and the cultural legacy of pharaonic Egypt. 42. The dam eliminated the costly consequences of irregular Nile floods, which helped the Egyptian population to double since the dam was built. This doubling, however, made the overall supply of Nile water, however distributed throughout the year, inadequate for Egyptian needs. The desert air evaporates a sixth or more of the Nile's annual flow from Lake Nasser, as hydrologists expected. Eventually, this loss cost Egypt In the 1970s, in a moment of generosity, President Anwar Sadat suggested that Israel might make use of some Nile water. In the 1990s, Egypt had none to spare and lived in fear of the moment when Sudan or Ethiopia expanded its use of Nile water and of climate change that might reduce the Nile's total flow. The Aswan High Dam postponed a day of reckoning for Egypt. Nasser often pointed to Egypt's growing population as justification enough for the dam. But by the end of the century, water was short again, Egypt dependent again, and additional environmental costs were visited upon Egyptians, present and future. Muhammad Ali, Lord Cromer, and Nasser traded the only large, ecologically sustainable irrigation system in world history, one which sustained the lives of millions for 5 millennia and made Egypt the richest land in the Mediterranean from the Pharaohs to the Industrial Revolution, for this postponement. Such are the pressures of politics. The impacts of the dam did not stop at Egypt's borders. To build it, Nasser required an agreement with Sudan on water sharing. After difficult negotiations and a military coup in Khartoum, he got it in 1959. The new Khartoum government faced a violent reaction from some 50,000 Nubians, a minority population in northern Sudan whose towns and villages stood to sink beneath Lake Nubia, as the Sudanese portion of the reservoir is known. Sudan had to use its army to force them to relocate. 20 years later, they still wanted their riverside homes and date palm groves back again. 43. In what may be its most durable consequence, the Aswan High Dam altered the waters and biota of the Mediterranean. After 1964, Little Nile water, about 10% of former quantities, reached the sea, and since the Mediterranean receives little river water to begin with, the subtraction of the Nile's flow made a substantial difference to the salinity of the eastern Mediterranean. In this salter sea, new species thrived. Ever since the Suez Canal opened in 1869, fish could swim between the Mediterranean and the Red Seas. Few that did so survived until the Mediterranean got salty enough to suit Red Sea creatures. But after Aswan, a mass migration began of fish, mollusks, and other creatures. They colonized the eastern Mediterranean, most thoroughly in Levantine waters, but all the way west to Sicily. These Leseptian migrants in some cases proved useful commercial fish, especially for Israeli trawlers. The Indo-Pacific and Mediterranean fish faunas, separate for geological ages, were united in an irrevocable bioinvasion that will continue to reshuffle the food web of the Mediterranean for some time to come. The calculations behind the Suez Canal and the Aswan High Dam were responses to fleeting political circumstances. The biotic changes they brought will endure for millions of years. 44. The Revolution of the Waters, Italy's Po Valley. Struggles for power, political and electrical, revamped water, economy, and society in Italy too. The spectacular geopolitical and economic success of Britain and Germany in the 19th century inspired reforms, revolutions, and reconfigurations of nature throughout Europe. In southern Europe, as in Egypt, political elites sought to unleash the latent economic energies of their societies, foment population growth, and enrich the state by any number of strategies. A favorite was industrialization. It required inanimate energy, efficient infrastructure, additional food surplus for urban workers, as well as vast social change. Northern Italy, after 1890, featured all this in concentrated form. 45. The Po River Basin covers a sixth of Italy and is home to a third of its population. It is for the most part flat, and for millennia posed drainage problems for those who would farm its fertile soils. Roman colonists, medieval monks, and Renaissance princes all tried their hands at taming the meandering waters of the basin. Despite their efforts, the lands between the Apennines and the Alps contained, in 1890, plenty of marshes, few roads, little industry, and, in the summer months, lots of malaria. But with political will, investment capital, and suitable technology, all this could change. In the Upper Po Valley, landlords and governments from the 18th century sought to capitalize on the agricultural potential of wetlands and seasonal pasture. With massive investment and heroic labor, Lombards replumbed their landscape, building drainage and irrigation canals, and making much of Lombardy suitable for rice. 46. These efforts climaxed in the Cavour Canal, finished in 1866. After 1882, the government of newly unified Italy, as of 1861, generously subsidized further drainage, irrigation, and channelization. The help came at a convenient time, as Italian farmers after 1870 felt the effects of cheap American wheat and Burmese rice. Pavelli landowners quickly took advantage of state aid. Between 1882 and 1914 they confined the waters to chosen times and places, drained the marshes dry, regularized the shapes of their fields, adopted farm machinery and chemical fertilizers, and doubled or tripled agricultural output, mainly of wheat, maize, rice, but of specialty crops like alfalfa, hemp, and sugar beet too. In so doing, they almost eliminated the pomarshes, and their fishing hunting horticultural way of life. 47 Malaria began to recede as well. This was but the beginning of the revolution of the waters. 48 By the 1890s, Milanese visionaries saw white coal, hydroelectric power, in the alpine torrents that fed the Pa. With enthusiastic state support, Piedmont and Lombardy built dams and power stations enough to underwrite the rapid industrialization of Milan and Turin. Italy lacked coal. Italian factories paid 8 times as much for coal as did English ones. If Italy were to compete with the energy-intensive economies of the 20th century, only hydroelectric power could drive the necessary transformation of Italian ecology and society. As one captain of finance, Giuseppe Colombo, put it, the transmission of electricity over long distances represents a fact of such extraordinary significance for Italy that even the most powerful imagination would have difficulty foreseeing all the possibilities. It is something that could alter completely the face of the nation, that could one day carry the nation to the ranks of the best endowed countries in terms of natural resources and industry. When countries that had previously grown rich on coal run out, it will then be the turn of nations with rich sources of flowing water. 49. Italy had the water cascading down from the Alps, and tried to take its turn. Italy's first hydroelectric plant dates to 1885, its first big one to 1898. By 1905, Italy led all Europe in hydroelectric power use. By 1924, Italy produced 1.8 million kilowatts. Over the next 15 years, it grew 1,000-fold. In 1937, hydropower furnished Italy with almost all its electricity. Most came from the Alps, where the glaciated valleys lent themselves to dams. Scores of dams and artificial lakes appeared after 1890, inundating forest and pasture alike. The alpine lakes of Como, Maggiore, and Guarda became reservoirs. Power transmission lines festooned Lombardy. Milan was the second city in the world to electrify street lighting. The textile industry, which in the 19th century had migrated up into the Alpine hills to be closer to supplies of wood and water power, descended to the Pa Valley once electrification arrived. In the years 1901 to 1927, 3/4 of Italy's industrial workers toiled in the electrified triangle between Milan, Turin, and Genoa. 50 rural electrification allowed farmers to pump water uphill and gave a fillip to marsh drainage efforts after 1920.51. The ecological transformation of northern Italy fed upon itself. Italy's emergence as a European and imperial power after 1890 rested on this electrification. Northern Italy created metallurgical, railroad, shipbuilding, aircraft, and other strategic industries before, during, and especially after World War I. Its armed forces, as late as 1896 humbled by defeat in Ethiopia, became a semi-industrialized military by the 1930s. Mussolini, dictator from 1922 to 1943, aimed for economic independence and military rearmament at the same time. Italian factories churned out ships, vehicles, munitions, and weaponry enough to allow Mussolini to fight first in Ethiopia and then intervene in the Spanish Civil War in 1936-1938. Italy built and supplied a navy that by 1936 seriously concerned Britain in the Mediterranean and could dream of reincarnating that sea as Rome's Mare Nostrum. Without alpine hydropower, harnessed in the ongoing environmental transformation of northern Italy, Mussolini's geopolitics would have been impossible, instead of merely impractical. 52. The pace of environmental change, while socially disruptive, caught the fancy of some Italians, notably the militantly avant-garde intellectuals and artists known as futurists. The sculptor-painter Umberto Boccioni gave voice to this view. Infinitely sublime is the juggernaut of man, pushed along by research and creativity, by the paving of roads, the filling of lakes, the submerging of islands, the building of dams, by leveling, squaring, drilling, breaking, erecting. This is the divine restlessness that will blast us into the future. 53. It certainly helped blast Italy into fascism. The social change that accompanied the environmental reconfiguration of northern Italy was quick and wrenching. Industrialization fostered a class-conscious proletariat in Milan and Turin. The creation of rice and maize fields from the marshlands similarly spawned a growing class of landless rural laborers. Capital-intensive enterprises took the place of family-based fishing, hunting, and horticultural exploitation of the floodplain. Valley landowners, large and small, often saw their interests in conflict with those of the urban and rural workers. After 1919, these landed farmers provided strong support for Mussolini's fascist movement. So did the new industrial barons of the north, whom hydroelectricity had helped to make. The reconfiguration of environment and society went hand in hand. After 1890, changes came with disorienting speed and contributed a current to the river of political embitterment that climaxed in fascism. 54. The United States and the Colorado. After 1900, a gigantic water manipulation scheme transformed the American West. Three main river systems drain the West: the Colorado, the San Joaquin, Sacramento, and the Snake, Columbia. All three underwent radical redesign after 1900. I will tell the tale only once, for the Colorado. 55. The Colorado River drains a basin about the same size as that of the Indus, but its flow is much smaller. Rain is rare in its basin, and most of it evaporates before reaching the river channels. However, the Colorado used to flood spectacularly. In springtime, it carried many times its average flow and carried off great chunks of southwestern soils. Its silt load was 17 times that of the Mississippi. It was a wild and unruly river, but after 1900 the Colorado provoked a vehement response. In 1900, growers in California's Imperial Valley opened the Alamo Canal, which diverted Colorado River water from Mexico to their fields. In 1905 they built another canal, but a major flood destroyed part of the waterworks and inundated the valley, creating the Salton Sea. 56. Before long, President Theodore Roosevelt and the Southern Pacific Railroad joined forces with California growers to control the Colorado and safeguard agriculture in the valley. The first high dam, the Roosevelt, appeared in 1911 on a tributary, the Salt River. Many more dams and irrigation canals followed, most notably the Boulder Dam in 1935 at the Arizona-Nevada border on the Colorado itself. By 1964, 19 big dams controlled the Colorado system. The post-1964 Colorado was a different river. It had a much more even flow, with smaller seasonal variations. Vegetation along its banks changed accordingly, as survival there no longer required adaptation to a dramatic flood regime. The physical bed of the river changed a great deal too, as dams checked deliveries of silt and the scouring effect of big floods. Physical and biological changes seemed so great that after 1983 U.S. authorities intentionally allowed huge releases of dammed water to simulate former floods, in hopes of recreating conditions of the old regime. The river's chemistry changed too. It came to carry much less silt and much more salt. Salinity tripled between 1917 and 1961, so that the paltry flow that passed through Mexico was nearly useless brine. By the 1980s, the Colorado's waters irrigated fields equal in area to Connecticut or Lebanon, including much of the Imperial Valley's fields of plenty. The waters generated a good chunk of the electricity used in the American Southwest. Roughly 15 million people depended directly on the new regime Colorado. Recasting the river suited some people, but not others. 7 American states and Mexico share the Colorado. The United States and Mexico wrangled over water quantity and quality from early in the century. Mexican farmers used the dregs of the Colorado for irrigation on the fields of Baja California and Sonora, especially after 1950 when Mexico built the Morelos Dam on the lower Colorado. Salinity became the major issue on account of return of irrigation water to the river. A 1973 agreement obliged the United States to reduce the Colorado's salinity through desalination works. In 1979, the United States rerouted some of the return irrigation water, achieving the same effect. But continued irrigation withdrawals and returns brought the problem back. The riparian American states locked horns over Colorado water from 1905, generating a spate of lawsuits unsurpassed by any river anywhere. Mark Twain allegedly said that whiskey is for drinking and water for fighting over. Colorado water, at least in this century, was for litigating over. As in India, dam building attracted political opposition in the American Southwest. The opponents were rarely humble folk who stood to be displaced by reservoirs, as they often were in India. Rather, they objected fundamentally to the transformation of the river, particularly its most scenic stretches, which often were the steep ones best suited to hydroelectric development. Gathering force in the 1950s, opponents organized by conservationist outfits such as the Sierra Club and the Audubon Society prevented dams in the Grand Canyon and in Dinosaur National Park. They lost in the case of Glen Canyon Dam, the second largest on the Colorado, completed in 1965-1964. But no significant new projects followed. The taming of the Colorado system reconfigured the American Southwest as thoroughly as the Indus scheme did the Punjab or the Soviet scheme did Central Asia. It made agriculture possible and air conditioning practical via cheap electricity and encouraged rapid development and population influx. The modern prominence of agriculture and industry in California and the Southwest, and the rise of the United States as a giant on the Pacific Rim, depended on this harnessing of the Colorado and equivalent events on the Columbia. The international character of the Nile, Indus Basin, Sir Daria, and Colorado points up another issue which late in the century came to concern states and people around the world: water security. With growing populations, growing economies, and insufficient water conservation, the demands for water use grew continually. In parts of the world where supply was short and shared among nations, conflict regularly emerged. Most of the big rivers of the world are international ones, and many provide the only, or almost the only, significant source of water supply in dry regions. Negotiations rarely led to mutually satisfactory arrangements, certainly not for Mexico, but they prevented outright war. Disputes over water from the Nile, Jordan, Tigris, Euphrates, Niger, Mekong, Brahmaputra, Zambezi, and La Plata, to name a few, will test the skill of negotiators in the future. 57. The experience of the Indian subcontinent, Central Asia, the American Southwest, and the Mediterranean with large-scale water manipulation was a mixed one. It allowed great increases in food and electricity supply, and created a welter of serious environmental problems at the same time. Almost every country in the world practiced irrigation on some scale and experienced similarly mixed results. Dams and irrigation held great appeal for those who made decisions. The benefits were tangible and immediate, and a tantalizing share could easily be captured by the state, big landowners, and powerful industries. The costs could often be shunted onto the poor, the powerless, foreigners, or the future. For these reasons, the world's total irrigated area spread from 50 million to nearly 250 million hectares between 1900 and 1995. As the table shows, the fastest expansion took place between 1950 and 1980. China more than doubled its irrigated area between 1950 and 1976, one of the distinctions of Mao's rule. 58 By 1980 the world's best dam sites had been used, but the search for good ones continued. At the end of the century, Brazil, Quebec, Venezuela, and Nepal were building or planning further gigantic irrigation or hydroelectric schemes, and China was building the mother of all dams. Table 6.1 Global Irrigated Area, 1900-1990. Sen existed only on paper for 70 years. Then, in the wake of the uprising that climaxed at Tiananmen Square in the spring of 1989, venerable leaders such as Li Ping decided to show China and the world that the Communist Party remained firmly in charge. Reviving the Three Gorges project and imprisoning its critics suited this agenda because, with a few exceptions, foreign governments, banks, and environmental groups did not support it. A heroic-scale project, firmly in the tradition of Chinese Marxism, would help burnish the image of the party. The resuscitation of the Three Gorges Dam proved controversial and divisive among the Chinese elite, but if finished according to plan, it will be the largest water project in world history. It will create a lake as long as Lake Michigan and displace 1 million to 2 million people. It will radically alter conditions for fish, water birds, and the river dolphin that inhabit the Yangtze waters. It will trap the sediment of one of the world's most silt-laden rivers, depriving the Yangtze Delta, China's richest soil, of its customary replenishment. And it will drown a slice of China's cultural patrimony and some of its most admired scenery, inspiration to centuries of poets and artists. In return for these costs and risks, China hopes to improve navigation on the Yangtze, to control the floods of an often dangerous river, and to add about 10% to its hydroelectric capacity. 59. The Three Gorges Dam will change the Yangtze and the East China Sea as much as the Aswan Dam altered the Nile and the Mediterranean Sea. Water manipulation served the political interests of the powerful, but it also eased the lot of millions. For those not flooded out by dams, not beset by waterborne diseases, and not affected by salinization, dams and diversions often proved a great help. Irrigated fields accounted for 16% of the world's total cultivated area in 1990, and for some 30% of total food production. Hydroelectricity in 1995 supplied about 7% of the world's total commercial energy and 20% of its electricity. For these reasons, large-scale water manipulation in the 20th century helped ease the lot of humankind. Against this slate of successes in food and energy production stands a dismal environmental record. More than half the century's diverted water was wasted; it either evaporated or infiltrated before reaching a crop or a turbine. Dam building techniques developed in the United States or the USSR were transferred unreflectively to zones of high evaporation, maximizing water loss. That same technique was also exported to lands highly susceptible to erosion, such as Algeria and China, where siltation forced the early abandonment of reservoirs, in one case in China even before the dam was finished. By 1980, salinization corroded agriculture on about a quarter of the irrigated land in India, Pakistan, the United States, and Egypt. 60 In the 1990s, salinization seriously affected about 10% of the world's irrigated lands. By 1996, it ruined land as fast as engineers could irrigate new land, so that the world's total irrigation area remained roughly constant. 61 Waterlogging and nutrient leaching aggravated problems. Throughout the century, irrigation almost always amounted to a short-term maximization strategy. To save money and effort on drainage and conservation measures, farmers and engineers mortgaged the future. This grand global plumbing project not only jeopardized future farming, it also destroyed the livelihoods, and sometimes the lives, of masses of people in the 20th century. Dams displaced millions without compensation, perhaps 40 million over the course of the century, 3/4 of them in India and China. Reservoirs and canals help spread diseases whose pathogens or whose insect vectors breed in water. The list includes malaria, schistosomiasis, cholera, typhoid, and many other notable killers. Inadvertently, water manipulation certainly killed millions in the 20th century. 62 Recasting the world's rivers ranks among the signal environmental changes of the 20th century. Taming floods and draining wetlands. Diversions and dams account for the most important physical changes in the world's cycling of fresh water. The major point of such actions was to get more water to the right places at the right times. But people have also sought to get water out of places where it interfered with agriculture or other useful activity. In the 20th century, this happened most notably in river floodplains and in wetlands. The point of river channelization is to tame floods, ease navigation, and farm fertile bottomlands. It is an expensive business because it involves building a channel for wayward rivers, confining waters to that channel, and keeping them out of floodplains. Only prosperous societies have undertaken it on any scale. Imperial China tried hard to constrict its rivers, but in modern times Europe and North America led the way. The Rhine's route was shortened and straightened beginning soon after 1800. In Illinois, where floodplains were managed more by beavers than people until after 1800, a quarter of the state's river length was channelized by 1990, including half the Illinois River. About 6 to 7% of U.S. rivers flow between man-made banks today. 63 The greatest efforts went into straitjacketing the Mississippi. The Mississippi is the third longest, the sixth muddiest, and by volume the eighth largest river in the world. Its basin covers 41% of the lower 48 U.S. states. When it flooded, people noticed. The first levees appeared on the lower Mississippi in the 18th century, and others popped up throughout the 19th century in communities that had enough money and ambition to try to deflect floodwaters onto their neighbors. The federal government sponsored levees after 1895. But a serious concerted challenge to Big Muddy's flood regime came only after 1927. That spring and summer saw one of the biggest floods in the river's known history. From the confluence of the Ohio River and the Mississippi on south, the water overflowed banks and levees in 170 counties, killed several hundred people, and at points formed a shallow lake 160 kilometers wide. New Orleans was saved only by dynamiting levees upstream to let the water spread out over rural Louisiana and Mississippi. Herbert Hoover, then Secretary of Commerce, successfully organized a huge relief effort, which helped earn him enough support to win the presidency in 1928. After the flood, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers tackled the Mississippi systematically. Flood Control Acts in 1928 and 1936 authorized levees on almost the entire lower half of the river, connecting local ones into one great system of levees, dams, and reservoirs that would in theory confine the river to a single channel. The Corps straightened the river to ease navigation, shortening it by 229 kilometers between 1932 and 1955. The Corps' defenses worked fairly well against floods in 1951, 1965, 1969, and 1973. By 1990, the Mississippi had 26 dams and several thousand kilometers of dikes and levees. But levees have their limits, which a 1993 flood overtopped, drowning 500,000 hectares in 9 states and costing $12 billion in damage. Channelization meant that fewer floods inflicted serious damage to people and property, but because it invited settlement and investment in floodplains, it also meant that the biggest floods caused more damage than they otherwise might. The 1993 flood prompted major reconsideration of channelization in the 1990s. Nonetheless, so many people and so much investment is fixed in the floodplains of the Mississippi and its tributaries that it is hard to imagine a major departure from the pattern of the recent past. 64. Channelization affected entire alluvial ecosystems. It cut the main branch of the Mississippi off from its previous banks, oxbows, and floodplains, presenting aquatic wildlife with novel conditions. Many species lost their spawning grounds, and the river's fish catch dropped dramatically. The freshwater mussels, which used to filter river water and reduce the consequences of pollution, declined too. Several mussel species went extinct. The southernmost levees channeled silt out into the Gulf of Mexico, where it fell over the continental shelf, starving the Mississippi Delta of silt. The delta and the bayou country began to sink and shrink. 65. Wetlands drainage. One of the reasons Mississippi floods were hard to manage was the draining of wetlands, which buffered floods in the American heartland. Draining wetlands is probably almost as old as agriculture. Ancient civilizations engaged in it, and medieval Europeans became very skilled at it. Until the 1960s, almost no one thought a wetland more useful than drained land. Hence, a spectacular assault took place on the world's wetlands, wherever sufficient money, labor, and technology were assembled. The fringes of the North Sea were one such place. Diking and drainage began in ancient and medieval times, and expanded especially in Holland in the 16th to 17th centuries. The famous Dutch windmills, built to pump water from former peat bogs, date from this era. But technology and skills of the 20th century allowed more ambitious work than ever before, culminating after a disastrous storm flood in 1953 in the closing off of several estuaries of the Rhine, followed by extensive reclamation. Half the Dutch population now lives below sea level, thanks to reclamation work. The English fens, where ambitious drainage began in 1630, also underwent a transformation in the 20th century. Diesel and electric pumps replaced steam engines and windmills, and a lot more of the fens dried out. In Holland and England together, an area equal in size to Luxembourg was reclaimed, most of it after 1900, half of it from the North Sea, half from inland bogs and wetlands. It ranks among the best farmland in Europe. Irrigation is now practiced in the fens. 66. In the 19th century, one of the bigger wetlands areas in the world dotted North America, from Manitoba and the Dakotas to Ontario and Ohio. Most of this expanse was seasonally waterlogged, often malarial, and impossible to farm. The novelist Charles Dickens visited southern Illinois in 1842 and found dismal swamp, on which the half-built houses rot away, cleared here and there for the space of a few yards, and teeming, then, with rank unwholesome vegetation, in whose baleful shade the wretched wanderers who are tempted hither, droop, die, and lay their bones. A hotbed of disease, an ugly sepulchre, a grave uncheered by any gleam of promise, a place without one single quality, in earth or air or water, to recommend it. 67. Locals set to work trying to drain the swamps and raise more wholesome vegetation. Digging and dredging drainage ditches was slow work, sometimes involving ditch plows that required up to 68 oxen. 68. After 1870, prairie farmers resorted to tile drains, ceramic tubes that carried water underground to the nearest stream. By 1880, over 1,000 tile factories in Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio were converting clay prairie soils into drain tile, and farmers were converting wet prairie and year-round swamps into rich grainland. Reclamation was especially rapid in the years 1900 to 1920 and 1940 to 1970. By 1970, American farmers had drained about 17 million hectares, providing the United States with some of its best farmland, creating the Corn Belt and obliterating wildlife. 69. Elsewhere in the United States, farmers and the Army Corps of Engineers were nearly as active. In the South, especially in the Mississippi River bottomlands in Arkansas, Mississippi, and Louisiana, an area equivalent to Belgium was drained after 1930. Part of this took place in the context of systematizing the levees on the river. But after 1960, high prices for soybeans and rice, which do well in the frost-free bottomlands, prompted further drainage. The Great Central Valley of California was converted from wetland to farmland and pasture after 1870. The Florida Everglades. In 1880, about 1.6 million hectares, declined by half by 1970. According to a recent estimate, wetlands in 1780 covered about 100 million hectares, or 15% of the lower 48 states. By the 1980s, 53 million hectares remained. 70. Most of this drainage occurred in the 20th century, almost all since 1865. As usual, agriculture's gain was wildlife's loss. About a third of the endangered species in the United States make their homes in wetlands. 71. Another area where frontier agriculture and modernizing states took on wetlands was the mangrove coasts of South and Southeast Asia. 72. From the 19th century, ambitious colonial regimes in India, Burma, and Indochina sought to settle peasant farmers in the expansive deltas of the Ganges, Brahmaputra, the Irrawaddy, the Mekong, and several other rivers. After independence, the successor regimes eagerly continued. Thailand encouraged similar development of the Chao Phraya River. The point was to grow more rice, either for the world market or for domestic self-sufficiency. In the Sundarbans, the Ganges, Brahmaputra coastal delta, and the lower Irrawaddy, much the same scale of transformation occurred between 1880 and 1980. In each place about 800,000 hectares of wetlands went into other uses, mostly wet rice cultivation. Population quintupled in both deltas. And tremendous, unknown changes to the delta's biotas resulted. Indonesia, after 1970, attempted much the same program on a far larger scale in the coastal mangroves of Kalimantan and Sumatra. On one calculation, wetlands loss in 6 South and Southeast Asian countries came to about half of 13 million hectares between 1900 and 1980. The Philippines eliminated 2/3 of its coastal mangroves between 1920 and 1980. 73 After 1980, vigorous global demand for shrimp prompted the replacement of mangrove wetlands by intensive and highly polluting shrimp farming in the Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, and elsewhere in Southeast Asia. All this meant a good deal more rice and shrimp and a lot less mangrove, a change no less welcome to most people than the transition from wetlands to farmlands in the North American heartland. The countless creatures that lost their habitats in these transformations, and the people who once made their livings there, might of course see matters differently. In the world as a whole over the 20th century, people drained about 15% of perhaps 10 million square kilometers of wetlands, the area of Canada. The United States drained half its wetlands, Europe 60 to 90%, New Zealand more than 90%, the great majority in the 20th century. 74 large-scale drainage continued in Africa, where in the 1970s the Sudanese government undertook a scheme, delayed by civil war after 1983, to build the Alamo Canal through the huge Sud swamp, depriving it of some its water so as to reduce evaporation loss and improve the water supply to the Nile downstream. The plan aimed to improve the lot of the Arab population, who supported the government, while visiting unknown ecological effects upon the rebellious Dinka and Nuer peoples of the south. In 1998, half the world's remaining wetlands lay in Siberia, Alaska, and northern Canada. They did not reward drainage efforts. More than a quarter lay in South America, including the world's single largest wetlands, the Pantanal of western Brazil, a candidate for drainage in the 1990s. This great frenzy of wetlands drainage in the 20th century stands with river taming among the major environmental changes of our time. Like several of the others, it meant more room for people, for crops, and for livestock, and less room for creatures less useful to humankind. Coastlines. Perhaps the ultimate indication of our urge to push the waters where we want them is the history of customizing coastlines. This requires keeping the ocean at bay, an act that requires confidence as well as expertise. The 20th century left an impressive record of coastal change, in places. Coasts are among the world's naturally most dynamic environments. Sea level changes, land subsides or emerges, mountains send down their silt, while tides and storms shifted about. Much of the 20th century effort to alter coastlines came as simple reaction to unwelcome natural trends or events. The human impact, while strong in the North Sea and Japan, was modest in Brazil or Mozambique. On those long coasts, nature's own lively rhythms held sway. The most ambitious recasters of coasts were the Dutch. In 1916, a storm surge spilled some of the North Sea onto the low-lying land surrounding the bay called the Zuiderzee. This provoked the Dutch Parliament to act on a plan developed in 1890 to seal off and drain the bay. Construction of the enclosing dam began in the 1920s and finished in 1932. Work continued over the next 60 years, adding 13 to 14% more land to Holland, creating a new freshwater lake, and shortening the coastline by 300 kilometers. 75. Similar but smaller efforts around the world made land out of sea in dozens of countries, especially those, like Holland, where people were many, land short, and money abundant. Japan, Hong Kong, Singapore, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia showed particular interest in coastal modification after 1970. Japan's reclamation was on such a scale that in the 1980s, 40% of Japanese industry stood on man-made land. Tokyo Bay, where reclamation began in the 1870s, shrank by a fifth between 1960 and 1980 to accommodate the Japanese economic miracle. Singapore expanded its national territory by 10% through reclamation. The worldwide total is hard to estimate, but a good guess is that reclamation added to the world's land area by 100,000 to 500,000 square kilometers in the 20th century, equivalent to something between Iceland and Spain. 76. Conclusion. In the 20th century, humankind has altered the hydrosphere as never before. We used and diverted water on a scale no previous age could contemplate. By one calculation, at the century's end we directly consumed 18% of the total available freshwater runoff of the globe, and appropriated 54% of it in one manner or another. 77 In places, successful water diversions eased constraints on economic development and human well-being. Irrigation made a big difference in the human condition. Without it, we would either have eaten less, eaten differently, or farmed a third again as much of the earth. In dry lands, it created constraints almost as fast as it eased them, and may in cases now seem a mistaken course. Groundwater use often became groundwater mining, permitting local and regional population and economic expansions while the water lasted. The straitjacketing of rivers with dams and channels recast habitats in order to make rivers more convenient for human use. Draining wetlands obliterated habitats in order to make land for human use. The physical changes to the hydrological cycle were vast in their consequences for wildlife, for people and societies, and insofar as we have constrained the future in order to liberate ourselves from the past, for posterity as well. In the distant past, only societies that could concentrate vast armies of laborers could make big changes to the hydrosphere. In the 20th century, societies with powerful technologies and sufficient wealth could do it. Rich countries customized their shares of the hydrosphere much more thoroughly than did poor ones. Colonial powers often could concentrate armies of laborers to execute large-scale public works, as in Punjab. After the waning of colonialism, ambitious rulers often seized upon water projects as useful for their domestic and international ends, as in modern India or Egypt, using energy-intensive technology when available and armies of laborers when needed. The height of dam building and wetlands drainage occurred in the decades of the Cold War, when the United States and the Soviet Union saw themselves locked in an economic and public relations struggle for which water projects, both within their borders and without, seemed most useful. As was so often the case in 20th century environmental history, political agendas helped propel the replumbing of the hydrosphere. Chapter 7. The Biosphere, Eat and Be Eaten. It is far from easy to determine whether she has proved to man a kind parent or a merciless stepmother. Pliny the Elder, Natural History. A now obscure Austrian geologist, Edward Suess, coined the term biosphere. Two titans of 20th century science, the Russian geochemist Vladimir Ivanovich Vernadsky and the French Jesuit paleontologist Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, popularized the concept. Here I use the term as they did, to mean the space inhabited by living things, from the ocean depths to the mountain tops. It includes bubbling seafloor vents teeming with bacteria, Himalayan glaciers home to the occasional beetle, and everything in between. It thus intersects parts of the hydrosphere, lithosphere, and atmosphere. It is the sum of all habitats, home to all the biota. That biota evolved without reference to humankind for about 3.5 billion years. Humanity, at least in our primitive form, arrived 4 million years ago. For most of the last 4 million years, most of the biota continued to evolve without our influence, because we stayed in small sections of the biosphere, mostly in Africa. We were few in number and technologically little superior to other primates, merely one species among many. Then, perhaps 500,000 years ago, we domesticated fire, allowing us far greater influence over plants and animals. This helped us colonize much of Africa and Eurasia. About 30,000 to 40,000 years ago, we developed new tools, perhaps better communication, and more formidable social organization. With this departure, we became a rogue primate, genuinely dangerous to many other forms of life, and disproportionately influential in coevolution. Our capacity to alter biotas grew further with the domestication of plants and animals some 10,000 years ago. That permitted quicker expansion of our numbers, greater division of labor, and faster technological change, which in turn led to further domestication, in a positive feedback loop that accounts for the general direction and character of subsequent human history. By the 20th century, our numbers, our high-energy technologies, and our refined division of labor with its exchange economy made us capable of total transformation of any and all ecosystems. Some remained little affected, such as seafloor vents. But in most of the biosphere, coevolution gave way to a process of unnatural selection whereby chances for survival and reproduction were apportioned largely according to compatibility with human action. In this new regime, those creatures symbiotic with us prospered greatly. These included those that suited our needs and adapted to domestication, and those that found suitable niches in our changing, churning biosphere. Creatures we found useful but incapable of domestication, and those that could not adjust to a human-dominated biosphere faced extinction or at best survived on sufferance. In the 20th century, we became what most cultures long imagined us to be, lords of the biosphere. The theme of this chapter and the next is the progress of this selection for symbiosis with humanity. Their refrains are the massive scale of human impact on the biosphere in the 20th century, the prominence of science, technology, and transport in this impact, and its often inadvertent character. What Marx said of human history became true more broadly: men make their own biosphere, but they do not make it just as they please. Microbiota, the first lords of the biosphere. For 2 billion years, microbes reigned as lords of the biosphere. They helped shape climate, geology, and all life. Since they outnumber all other life forms handily, even insects, one might say life on Earth was democratic. It is less so now, with the success of Homo sapiens. We engineered a biological coup d'etat, culminating since 1880 with an attempted extermination of some of the previous masters. But, as with most coups, the aftermath was full of surprises and the new regime unstable. The 20th century was a tumultuous one in the balance between people and microbes, partly because of conscious human efforts to attack disease and pests, and partly as a side effect of large-scale social and ecological changes. Microbial life comes in a bewildering variety of forms. Some of it, from the human point of view, is most useful. You couldn't digest a meal without the help of millions of bacteria in your alimentary canal. A small portion of it has long interfered with human designs and desires by causing disease, among us or among the plants and animals that nourish and work for us. It is these microbes that I will focus on here. People have struggled to prevent and cure diseases for millennia, but before 1880 these efforts only occasionally affected the balances between society and microbes. After the 1880s, with the work of Louis Pasteur, Robert Koch, and many others who deciphered the role of microbes and insects in disease transmission, doctors and public health officials knew enough to effect basic shifts. The more people learned about microbes, the easier it became to kill them. Armed with emerging knowledge of microbiology and inspired by ideas of progress, medical officials attacked disease on many fronts. This began in Western Europe and the United States, where scientific knowledge in the 19th century was expanding quickly, and the gospel of progress, which held that disease control was not merely possible but an obligation, held sway. Two trends posed sharp challenges. Rapid industrialization and urbanization created huddled masses of often malnourished people in European and American cities, among whom disease spread easily. In addition, especially after the burst of imperialism that began around 1880, military campaigns and occupations in Asia and Africa put European soldiers within range of malaria, yellow fever, and other formidable infections. These challenges made the war on disease seem especially urgent and helped recruit funds and manpower. There were three main responses: environmental manipulation, meaning here sanitation, insect, tick, and rodent control, and other measures to make human environments less propitious for pathogens, discovery and manufacture of antibiotics, and vaccination and immunology. With these developments, humanity between 1880 and 1960 stole a march on pathogens, sharply reducing the human disease burden, encouraging rapid population growth, and fundamentally changing the human and microbial condition. Environmental disease control after 1830. Public health measures designed to adjust human ecology and behavior in ways that would inhibit the spread of disease became widespread and systematic after 1850, first in northwestern Europe. The pioneers were doctors and social reformers, the sponsors were governments, armies, and philanthropic organizations. The main achievements were cleaner water, better housing, and insect control. The cholera epidemics that terrorized European and North American cities after 1832 prompted the organization of public health authorities. Cholera had long existed in India, but improved transport and greater human migration, especially of soldiers, allowed it to break out in the early 19th century, killing millions around the world. In Europe, cholera and other scourges provoked official reaction. Slowly, authorities began to improve urban sanitation and check the ravages of infectious diseases, especially cholera, typhus, and tuberculosis. Simultaneously, Muslim authorities, notably Muhammad Ali in Egypt, organized efforts to combat cholera, which had become a frequent companion to pilgrims to Mecca after 1831. By 1890, the Hajj came under medical regulation in Egypt. By 1920, those diseases controllable by improved housing, by cleaner water, or by port quarantines had receded considerably, not only in Europe and America, but in Bengal, Argentina, Japan, everywhere that public health measures took effect. The program of late 19th century imperialism posed stiff challenges for environmental control of disease organisms. Armed with the tools and wealth created in the crowded, unhealthy industrial cities, Western Europeans, and later Americans and Japanese, created colonial empires that spanned the globe by 1900. The process of building such empires required moving soldiers all over the world, and the outcome: more mines, plantations, and taxes sent streams of refugees and laborers this way and that. Migrations and invasions often put people in microbial harm's way. New disease regimes came with patterns of large-scale, long-distance labor migration in the 19th century. In their time, slave trades, particularly the Atlantic trade, had helped shape the global distribution of diseases. But with the suppression of slave trades and slavery, after 1850, tens of millions of indentured laborers moved throughout the plantations and mining camps of Africa, Asia, the Pacific, and the Caribbean. Like slaves before them, they carried old infections with them and encountered new ones where their journeys ended. This swirl of human and microbial migration put many at greater risk. Peasants moving from Mozambique to South African mines, Melanesians working in the sugarcane fields of Australia, and Indians toiling in Trinidad all faced alien and adverse disease environments. Imperialism also knitted cities around the world into tighter contact and gave a fillip to urbanization, especially of port cities such as Alexandria or Durban. All these developments promoted epidemics by exposing millions of people to diseases new to them and by creating social conditions more propitious for the spread of infection. Many Asians and Africans paid for it with their lives. So did European soldiers and settlers, from West Africa to Indochina. Their plight provoked an effective medical response. From the 1880s, researchers began to unravel the transmission cycles of malaria, yellow fever, and other killers that interfered with imperialism. After scientists established the central role of mosquitoes as disease vectors, they quickly devised measures such as mosquito netting and wetlands drainage to limit the circulation of infection. Dutch, French, and British doctors made tropical Asia and Africa far safer for Europeans after 1890. American counterparts performed the equivalent for Cuba and the Philippines after 1898, when the United States acquired these lands from Spain, and then for Panama's Canal Zone, created in 1904. Efforts to safeguard local populations in the tropics sparked less interest. But with the vast expansion of imperialism, especially in Africa, European authorities intervened in health matters where their interests were threatened, and sometimes that meant fighting disease among locals as well as among Europeans. A significant reduction in the toll of tropical diseases took place after 1900, mainly among whites and mainly through successful interruption of disease transmission cycles. Colonial authorities were not alone in trying to improve health. Private philanthropy also played a major role in altering the relationships among humans and their pathogens in the early 20th century. For example, beginning in 1908, the Rockefeller Institute Sanitary Commission bankrolled and organized campaigns to eliminate hookworm in the American South, where it had for generations caused iron anemia among a large proportion of Southerners. Oil tycoon John D. Rockefeller, a Baptist, took particular interest in the health and vitality of the millions of Baptists in the South. In the 1920s, Rockefeller's men joined with the United Fruit Company to carry the struggle to Central America, where hookworm weakened its labor force. Rockefeller's medical philanthropy soon extended to Mexico, where yellow fever, a scourge in the coastal oil fields in which Rockefeller's Standard Oil held an interest, was virtually eradicated between 1920 and 1923. This program and others like it improved the health of millions in Brazil, West Africa, Ceylon, China, and elsewhere, and played no small role in making plantations and colonialism pay. A striking feature of this shift in the history of pathogens, in temperate and tropical zones alike, is the large role played by military doctors. 10 Big agglomerations of men crowded together in alien environments had always invited disease. Infections killed far more soldiers than did combat until the 20th century. European armies after 1880 managed to lower the toll taken by tropical diseases, especially making imperialism in the tropics feasible. But the Japanese army proved the most systematic, protecting its forces with multiple vaccinations in the successful war against Russia in 1904-1905, the first war in which battle deaths outnumbered disease deaths. 11. Indeed, the protracted mass slaughter of World War I required effective military medicine. Only after 1905 could doctors keep mass armies healthy enough that they could butcher one another en masse. Antibiotics after 1940. The success of public health measures based on environmental manipulation continued throughout the 20th century. After 1940, antibiotics added another weapon in the